New Year's Day, 1937. Across America, people greet the new year with a mixture of cautious hope and apprehension. Along with the rest of the world, America keeps a nervous eye on the growing might of Germany and the expanding empire of Japan. In Spain, bloody civil war rages on, a grim foreshadowing of the inferno to come. Back home, America is still gripped by the Depression, but for the first time in years, signs of hope can be seen. Here and there along the Ohio Valley, factories are running again, and business is picking up. Economists predict a strong recovery, and it appears that 1937 might be the best year the Ohio Valley has seen in a long time. 1 week later, it begins to rain. The Ohio River. For 981 miles, it winds its way through much of the nation's heartland. From Pittsburg, Pennsylvania to Cairo, Illinois, the river winds past sprawling cities and small towns, through forests and farmlands. Rich in history, from the earliest pioneers to the towering cities of today, the growth of the entire Ohio Valley region has depended on this great river. It is both the livelihood and the playground of many of those who live along its banks. Dams are built to control it and flood walls to contain it, and most of the time it remains placidly within its banks. But once in a while the river reminds everyone that ultimately it obeys no one's whims but its own. For anyone living along an inland waterway, floods will always be of life. In the Ohio Valley, minor flooding happens somewhere in the valley about every other year, and major floods occur about once each generation. As early as 1773, explorers reported seeing the river full bluff to bluff. More than a century later, the flood of 1884 broke all previous records, and its own record would stand for more than 50 years. The flood of 1913 caused extensive damage all along the valley and brought about an end of the famous Ohio Canal, which had carried barges from Cleveland to the Ohio River for more than 80 years. A massive ice flood in 1918 crushed whole riverboats in Cincinnati. Each time the waters receded, the towns and cities along the river would hotly debate the idea of building flood walls and levees to protect themselves. Although a few levees were built, most of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys had little real flood protection. Then, in 1927, a particularly disastrous flood hit the Mississippi River. Almost the entire town of Columbus, Kentucky was swept away. Cities along the Mississippi had had enough, and following the 27 flood, a massive program of flood protection was begun along the Mississippi Valley. Despite warnings that a similar disaster could hit the Ohio Valley, the lessons of the 1927 flood went largely unheeded. The Ohio River flooded in March 1936, bringing renewed talks of needed flood control. But with the nation still deep in the Great Depression, talks were as far as things went. Along its entire 981-mile length, only Portsmouth, Ohio had any significant flood wall protection. Built on a floodplain between the Ohio and Scioto rivers, the city had suffered greatly in 1913. Portsmouth now boasts proudly that its new 62-foot seawall can keep out any flood. The stage is set for January 1937. In December of 1936, moderate to heavy rain fell throughout the Ohio Valley watershed, saturating the ground. Then around the second week of January, meteorologists notice an unusual weather condition developing over the United States. A vast stationary cold front hangs over much of the Northwest, while another stationary cold front develops off the East Coast. Between these two fronts, humid tropical air masses flow northward over the Ohio Valley. The unusual weather pattern will persist for more than 2 weeks. The result is rain. By the time it's over, according to some estimates, 165 billion tons of rain. Between January 6th and the 12th, not a day passes that it isn't raining somewhere in the Ohio Valley. On the 13th and 14th, especially heavy rains fall throughout the region, and after a brief lull resume again on the 17th. From that day until the 25th, continuous heavy rains and sometimes snow sweep up and down the valley. At first, no one pays much attention to the slowly rising waters.
And the people just got so used to them that they just thought, here comes another flood, and they were going to hunk down and let it pass over them, and they didn't realize it was going to be such a severe flood as it was.
By the morning of January 18th, the river is at or passing flood stage from Point Pleasant, West Virginia, all the way to Cairo, Illinois. Although there is no panic, everywhere people are beginning to realize that this is no ordinary flood. With no end to the rains in sight, people begin preparing for the worst.
My husband called me and told me to lay in all the groceries I could find and run water in everything I could find so we'd have water. And I did run the tub through, and it immediately broke a thermos bottle, and so we had broken glass. We had to filter out whenever we used water.
All along the valley, government and relief organizations begin mobilizing. Along the Mississippi River, WPA workers reinforce existing levees, while a newspaper cartoon lampoons the inadequacy of flood protection in the Ohio Valley. It is increasingly apparent that mass evacuations might become necessary. As early as January 10th, the Red Cross begins issuing warnings to people in flood zones to be prepared to move. Refugee centers are planned. In Louisville, a temporary halt to the rising waters prompts false hopes that the worst might be over. But by Wednesday morning, January 19th, the river is creeping upwards again. By the afternoon of the following day, radio broadcasts are advising people to leave endangered areas as quickly as possible.
Louisville, Kentucky, January 20th.
This is WHAS, owned and operated by the Louisville Courier-Journal and the Louisville Times. The time is exactly 3:15 p.m. We have been asked to broadcast the following announcement. Warning to all river lowland dwellers. Already above flood stage, the river is expected to go at least 2 feet higher by morning. If your home is anywhere near the rising water, make plans to leave it at once.
With much of the city built on high ground, Cincinnati is less in danger than most cities in the Ohio Valley. Residents and businesses in low-lying areas begin moving furnishings and merchandise to upper floors. On the morning of January 21st, 2 more inches of rain fall within a few hours in the Cincinnati area. The river surges upwards, catching hundreds of merchants off guard. People who had come to work easily in the morning find themselves suddenly stranded by the rapidly rising water. With the city's power plants endangered, a race begins as hundreds of workers and volunteers fill and stack sandbags to keep out the surging waters. 100 miles upriver, another struggle is underway in Portsmouth as the river climbs within 2 feet of the top of the seawall. Cracks are appearing in the wall, and Portsmouth, which had sat safe and dry through every flood in the last 24 years, begins to think the unthinkable. Ironically, in Pittsburg, the waters are actually receding, as most of the recent rains have fallen downriver. Pittsburg will be the only major city in the Ohio Valley to suffer less in the 37 flood than in the flood of 1936. As darkness falls on Thursday night, January 21st, for most of the Ohio Valley, the flood of 37 is already the third worst in history, after the floods of 1884 and 1913. Already over 50,000 people have been forced to flee their homes, and with still more rain in the forecast, no one is taking any bets as to how much higher the river will go. Portsmouth, Ohio, 11 p.m. Thursday night. All over town, sirens and factory whistles give the signal: evacuate. Concerned over the weakening flood wall and mounting pressure in the city sewers, to prevent a catastrophe, Portsmouth is forced to open its floodgates. Residents are given 4 hours to evacuate, and at 3:15 a.m. Friday morning, the gates are opened. In a matter of hours, much of Portsmouth is underwater. In 48 hours, an average of 6 inches of rain has fallen across the valley. With the rain still coming down and no end in sight, a frantic race begins to prepare for what may become the worst flood in history. Relief efforts are doubled. In Kentucky, hundreds of National Guardsmen are sent to the flood zones while 2,000 others are mobilized. 4,000 more WPA workers are readied for flood relief. Utility officials warn that heat and light will fail if the water rises much higher. In Cincinnati, Lunken Airport is abandoned as the river pours over its flood wall. Safe and dry on a hilltop, Louisville's Bowman Field becomes a frantic hub of activity as relief supplies pour in by plane. Throughout the valley, officials go on radio telling people to remain calm as mass evacuations increase. By Friday afternoon, an estimated 80,000 people are homeless or displaced by the flood. As sewers overflow and more people are crowded into refugee centers, health officials fear a typhoid epidemic may result. Still more doctors and nurses are rushed into the flood zones, and inoculation centers are established. The forecast for Saturday: rain turning to snow. Saturday morning. A thick blanket of snow has fallen across the regions and temperatures drop into the lower 20s. The snow and the cold slows down the still rising river. But sooner or later, the snow must melt. Throughout most of the valley, by the end of this day, the flood will have surpassed the 1884 record, and the flood of 37 will officially be the worst in history. By now, homeless figures have reached 150,000 and still climbing. In refugee centers and makeshift hospitals across the region, tens of thousands huddle shivering in warehouses, gymnasiums, and anywhere space can be found for them. Thousands more huddle in tents. In flood-threatened areas, still thousands more remain in their homes as the waters come ever closer. Everywhere, furnaces shut down as basements flood.
And so then the next morning, our janitor knocked on the door and said, Miss Freeman said, we didn't give you any heat. The water's up over the furnace. And so we said, well, thank you.
In Ashland, Kentucky, floodwaters forced the steel mill to close, leaving 3,500 out of work. Despite the open gates, in Portsmouth the river spills over the seawall. By now, nearly half the city is underwater, and 18,000 have fled. In Louisville, water supplies are rationed by restricting water service to 2 hours a day. Throughout the day, temperatures rise and rain returns, washing tons of melting snow into the river. In 2 days, the river has risen nearly 6 feet. As water reaches power plants, officials warn that the electricity may go out at any time. In Cincinnati, the struggle continues to keep the power on, and is, for the moment, successful. Ironically, this success will lead to the worst catastrophe the Queen City will suffer in the flood. January 24th, 1937. Black Sunday. Although waters in Cincinnati are at their highest in history, the city's high ground has kept most of it above water, and Cincinnati has suffered less than most of the cities along the river. On this day, that will change. Earlier, rising backwaters have ruptured gasoline storage tanks in the Mill Creek Valley area, and by Sunday morning, thousands of gallons of gasoline cover the water for several blocks. According to an eyewitness, at 10:30 in the morning, a streetcar wire in front of the Crosley plant snapped. The power was still on. Sparks flew, and in minutes the river was a roaring inferno. Unable to reach the heart of the fire because of the floodwaters, all the firemen can do is try to contain it to the flooded areas. In a matter of hours, the flames engulf several industrial buildings, and explosion follows explosion as the fire reaches still more gasoline tanks. By late in the day, 32 buildings covering 3.5 square miles are in flames. Watching the towering black clouds, a local newspaper reporter coins the phrase, Black Sunday. Later, this phrase is deemed an appropriate description of events throughout the Ohio Valley on this day. In Frankfort, Kentucky, rioting breaks out in the state reformatory as floodwaters pour into the building. At least 12 of the 2,900 prisoners die. Fearful of a mass breakout, the governor pleads for the army to intervene. Eventually, the prisoners are evacuated to other jails, but at least 60 make their escape in the confusion. All along the river, power plants begin to fail as water extinguishes boiler fires. Without electricity, water pumps stop. And in the midst of the worst flood in history, most cities are without water. In Cincinnati, firemen standing hip-deep in floodwater fighting the huge flames see their hoses go dry as the city water supply fails. Undaunted, they disconnect the hoses from the fire plugs, stick them in the river, and go on fighting. For 1,000 miles, communications break down as telephones go out and radio stations go silent. Here and there in the flooded areas, lights still flicker. But by midnight Sunday night, most of the cities in the Ohio Valley are plunged into darkness. For tens of thousands, it will be a dark, cold, silent night.
See, it had enough electricity stored to last about an hour, and it just gradually got dimmer and dimmer and dimmer through that last hour, and I'm sure it was around 1 o'clock when it got pitch black.
By Monday morning, January 25th, the largest relief effort in peacetime history is underway. Thousands of federal troops are rushed to the flood zones. With the river still rising and more than half the city underwater already, martial law is declared in Louisville. In response to a national radio call for aid, hundreds of police officers from as far away as Boston come to Louisville to assist exhausted local authorities. Widespread fear of looting prompts harsh measures. But while some looting does occur, overall the incidents are minor. A far more pressing problem for the city is the evacuation and feeding of thousands of stranded people in flooded areas. On Saturday, Beargrass Creek had overflowed its banks, effectively cutting the city in two and isolating hundreds who had not yet left their homes. An ingenious solution. Empty whiskey barrels from a local brewery are used as pontoons in an emergency bridge along Baxter Avenue. As hundreds cross the bridge to safety, hundreds more line up at emergency relief centers seeking food, clothing, and shelter. In 3 days, the number of flood refugees in the Ohio Valley has doubled to over 300,000. Evacuation trains run 24 hours a day. Across the flooded regions, 1,575 refugee centers have been established. The largest of these is in Memphis, Tennessee, where an average of 60,000 people a day are processed by the Red Cross. Still, the river climbs. In Indiana, a refugee train is trapped by rising waters, and its frightened passengers will spend several days stranded on the train that was taking them to safety. As generators and battery-powered radio transmitters run down, entire cities are cut off from all outside communication. In makeshift hospitals, surgeons sometimes operate by candlelight. Food and water shortages appear, and the Red Cross renews appeals for aid. Soon more food and supplies stream towards the affected areas, but as of Tuesday, January 26th, the water is still rising. By the middle of the last week of January 1937, 12,721 square miles of the Ohio Valley are underwater. More than 500,000 people have fled their homes, while many thousands are trapped without heat or water on upper floors of homes, in offices, and flooded areas. There is still no end in sight. A massive, hasty, and often confused rescue effort is underway to reach those still isolated in their homes. Boats patrol the flooded areas, calling out to anyone trapped. Hundreds of volunteers man rescue boats of all descriptions. More than 7,000 boats are provided by the federal government, and practically anything else that can float is pressed into service. Despite the magnitude of the disaster, there is no panic, and rescuers are often surprised to find whole families intent on riding it out in their homes.
So found most of the statements about people being in trouble exaggerated. Worked rowing boats for 4 or 5 hours and only found 5 people that even wanted to leave their homes.
No, they want to go down the street a block and visit a friend, or go someplace to play cards with other friends, or they say, if you got cigarettes, the cigarettes disappeared, and everybody was frantic for cigarettes.
For those who choose not to leave, food, water, and milk are provided when possible.
It seemed to me that the best thing would be to keep the people in their houses if it was feasible. For instance, the 2-story houses, the water in the middle of the town did not get up to the 2nd floor of the houses. So if the people would take the furniture of the 1st floor and move it up to the 2nd floor or the attic and live up on the 2nd floor, why, it'd be better for them to stay in their own house, because looters could not get in then, or they could repel them, and they'd be more comfortable in their own houses, but the only thing you had to do was feed them. So we undertook, after we moved the people out of the town, the ones that had to go, whose houses were unlivable, why, was to keep the others in their houses. But once a day, go down those streets and offer them food of various kinds that we could find.
At night, an eerie silence falls over the darkened cities. The towering buildings loom as giant black silhouettes against a dark gray sky. Here and there, a dull glow from a candle or a lamp reveals where some hardy souls are staying put in their homes. And often all that can be heard is the rush of the water around the corners of the buildings. In daytime, along the shorelines of the flooded areas, sightseers sometimes hamper rescue efforts. And the even more curious cobble together anything that will float to get a closer look at the flooded areas. Boating down Main Street becomes a popular pastime. Few realize the dangers. The floodwaters are not only deep, but very swift. Strong currents lift whole houses from their foundations. In Paducah, Kentucky, a rescue boat strikes a submerged truck and overturns in the swift current. 13 people drown. For more than 2 days, Paducah is totally isolated, without a word getting out or in. Finally, the Coast Guard sends in boats to reestablish communication. So desperate is the situation here that a total evacuation of the entire city is ordered. When many prove reluctant to leave, the army is sent in to force compliance. By the end of the week, a city of almost 30,000 people is practically deserted. Jeffersonville, Indiana becomes a second city to be almost totally evacuated. The mass evacuations swell the numbers of refugees to more than 750,000. The river continues to climb. Between Wednesday, January 27th, and Thursday, January 28th, the river at long last will reach its crest. For more than 1,000 miles, only one bridge over the Ohio River has remained open, the Suspension Bridge in Cincinnati. A week ago, few people in Cincinnati would have believed that the river could ever top the flood of 1884. Now, with the waters 9 feet higher than anyone thought possible, people watch in wonder as the river rushes just a few feet below them. Normally, it would be a 30-foot drop to the surface. All along the valley, in city after city, the river reaches its high water mark. But the flood and its dangers are far from over. In Louisville, a varnish factory catches fire, and Louisville firefighters endure on a smaller scale the same hazards their Cincinnati brothers had faced earlier. Even an innovative fire truck on a raft cannot save the varnish plant, but at least the fire is kept from spreading. Everywhere, food and water remain in short supply, although the problem is more with distribution than actual shortages. Long lines form at water stations. By now, the plight of the flood-ravaged area has caught the country's attention, and even in a depression-strapped nation, goodwill, supplies, and helping hands pour in from everywhere. More than 40,000 volunteers flock to the Red Cross, asking what can we do to help. By truck, train, and plane, food, clothing, and medical supplies arrive by the ton. Distant cities send ambulances, fire, and water trucks to aid in any way they can. Without power, keeping the public informed becomes a monumental task. Newspaper reporters often work by candlelight. Fierce newspaper rivalries are set aside for the duration of the crisis. The Louisville Courier-Journal and Times and the Cincinnati Enquirer are all forced from their offices and presses by the flood. Rival papers in neighboring cities offer their presses to them. None miss an edition. From across the country, newsreel reporters and cameramen descend on the Ohio Valley. And soon vivid stories of the flood fill theater screens from coast to coast.
The roaring crest of the swollen Ohio practically engulfs Louisville in its race to the Mississippi. Here is one of the most astounding situations in the history of American catastrophes. More than 230,000 people, two-thirds of the great city's population, routed from their homes. As hour after hour of relentless rain soaked the Ohio Valley, citizens of the Kentucky metropolis saw the muddy waters rise to their doorsteps, then to their eaves, and finally to the higher ground in the very heart of the city, far from the river's bed. The City Hall is revetted with sandbags to protect it as headquarters for the unprecedented relief operations necessary. As military headquarters, for the city is under martial law. Isolated by crippled transportation facilities and with its lights put out by the flood, Louisville is in desperate straits. As fast as possible, people are being evacuated from the town, ferried to higher ground to save them from exposure and pestilence. Meanwhile, as the result of nationwide Red Cross appeals and other relief activities, food and medical supplies have begun to reach this and other beleaguered citizens. Army and National Guardsmen are getting the situation well in hand as the nation, under the personal direction of the President, moves to organize the greatest relief corps in history. However, with flooded homes, flooded stores and factories, useless lighting plants, little or no drinking water, limited food supplies, stalled transportation, scattered families, and other scenes of chaos, Louisville and its sister cities and towns along the great inland waterways are struggling against unbelievable conditions. They need help, and they need it now. Almost 1 million of our fellow citizens are helpless victims of disaster at its flood tide.
By the time the waters slowly begin to recede, nearly 800,000 are homeless, and over 600,000 of these cram refugee centers throughout the region. Fear of epidemic remains strong.
Federal and National Guard troops have joined the local authorities in a effort to check an outbreak of pestilence in Louisville. Floodwaters here are slowly subsiding, but in their wake are several hundred dead. Meanwhile, Louisville is attempting to take stock. 3/4 of the population is homeless and taking refuge in railroad cars, while the Director of Public Safety estimates that Louisville's $425 million worth of property will suffer damages amounting to half of that figure, a loss almost beyond comprehension. From all sections of the East, planes rush serum and blankets to the beleaguered population. Food supplies are being confiscated when necessary, but temporarily at least, Louisville will not go hungry, says Mayor Neville Miller, who has established at City Hall a bread line to take care of immediate need. These exclusive pictures, which reached this screen by special plane, were taken from Louisville by cameraman Markman, who risked his life to cross the river on the superstructure of a flood-swept bridge. Inundated as far as the eye can see, the surrounding countryside will be underwater for weeks. United States regulars of the 11th Infantry have relieved the police of Louisville, who had reached the limit of physical endurance after hour upon hour of arduous duty without rest. Gradually, the dazed populace is regaining confidence. The terror and chaos of the rescue period have changed to a determined fight against hunger and contagion. Added to the full catastrophes of food famine and pestilence, Louisville also is threatened by fire as a big varnish plant goes up in flames. The stricken flood zone drains the full cup of disaster. Louisville, Kentucky. The shaded portion of the map shows how the flooded Ohio almost completely engulfed the city. Here are startling scenes of the city's great West End residential section, now a veritable American Venice, but a Venice without people. In this one section, more than 60,000 had to flee for their lives as the river knocked angrily at their doors. Rich and poor, now refugees, and facing disease and epidemics. This great section is now under strict quarantine. No man may return to his home until sanitary conditions are okay once more. Battle against typhoid and other contagions never ceases. Even in the midst of disaster, death presents a strange picture. A flood victim gently borne by the very waters of doom. Still, the rescue work goes on, even though the waters are subsiding. City, state, and government forces have mobilized to care for the flood victims and to fight the twin specters of want and disease. With polluted water everywhere that leaves a deadly slime as it recedes, only greatest effort can prevent typhoid, dysentery, and other grave ailments. Yes, the water is going down, but not as fast as it came up. The flood crest has passed Louisville, but it will be many days before the city is dry out, before normal life can be resumed in this great metropolis, where more than 200,000 were made homeless. Feeding the refugees is like feeding a vast army, but no one goes without, thanks to the Red Cross and other agencies, and to the more fortunate citizens of Louisville themselves. They've even turned empty whiskey barrels into pontoon bridges to speed the work of mercy. More and more police have arrived from other cities to help the work of relief and rehabilitation. And now, with new money coming in from Chicago, business can tighten its belt and take a fresh start. Ingenuity is the order of the day in flood-stricken Louisville. An airplane motor drives the generator that lights an emergency hospital in the warfare against pestilence and disease. They're fighting against a dread menace, the worst aftermath of a flood. Another grave danger confronts the city. Weakened foundations. The seeping floodwater may have undermined some of the city's large buildings. Rigid measures must be made to check and assure their safety before Louisville citizens can breathe easily once more. Water pumped from cellars and receding floods are bearing many evidences of collapse. How would you like one of those to float into your backyard? Tank cars on the loose and other leaking gas tanks still threaten Louisville with the same fire hazard that struck the Cincinnati waterfront. the face of flood damage, fire, and other disaster, the main thought now is for sanitation and relief and water. Fresh drinking water for a water-soaked town. 200 lives so far lost through the flood in Louisville alone, and there'll be more. An experience so terrible is bound to take its toll. Terror, exposure, misery, and contagion. The shock troops of disaster are still rolling up their sad totals. But a new force is now in the field, the shock troops of relief, here by the hundreds from all parts of the country to help the people of Louisville on the road to recovery.
Preparing for the worst, in Louisville's Cave Hill Cemetery, a mass grave is quietly dug. It will fortunately not be needed. In a matter of weeks, over 790,000 people will be inoculated, and the much-feared epidemic does not occur.
They tell you where you could go and get your shots. And needles that they use today, the shots are in a throwaway syringe or needle. They shoot you and throw it away. There they used the same needle 40 times, and the last one they couldn't get through your skin. I'm not joking, it hurt terrible.
By early February, the waters are going down everywhere, and the long, dreary task of assessing the damage, cleaning up, and rebuilding begins. Layer after layer of mud and debris cover everything.
The flood crest is past, and the city's beginning to dry out. The worst is over, except for sickness and contagion. But what a gigantic job faces the stricken population. A beautiful city now piled high with trash, flotsam from the backwaters of the record inundation. And only gradually, a few at a time, are the people getting permission to return to their homes. Danger's not over yet. Many cave-ins give evidence of weakened foundations and unsafe buildings. But the big job is bailing out. It's like trying to pump out the ocean. The city's fairly filled with pumps, big pumps and little pumps, trying to put the Ohio River back to bed. Bucket brigades are doing a big share of the job, though. They have sit-downers here, too. One of the most curious aftermaths of the flood. Boats that were savers a few days ago. Now they're just in the way.
Louisville drains the dregs of misfortune. Weakened walls as a flood aftermath caused a gas leak, and a 3-story building is shattered by explosions. They've already found 10 bodies in the ruins, crushed by falling walls or burned by the resulting fire, and the search goes on for still other victims. Some of them were flood refugees living here until their homes dried out.
In the burnt-out sections of Cincinnati, the receding waters leave a strange sight. Block after block of half-burnt homes and buildings neatly sheared off at the waterline. By the middle of February, the river is back in its banks again, and the great flood of 1937 is over. But the effects will linger for months, the memories for generations. So many people have been displaced and so many families disrupted by the flood that newspapers print refugee lists of where people have gone. The lists run page after page. Before people can return to their homes, the homes will have to be inspected as the floodwaters have damaged hundreds beyond repair. Many will not have homes to come back to. Thousands lose everything they own. In some areas, the damage is so extensive that entire neighborhoods will have to be abandoned. The cleanup will take months, and thousands of workers who came to fight the floodwaters will stay for the rebuilding.
a lineup of volunteers in a new kind of army. An army of WPA workers being formed to attack the mud and debris left by the flood in Louisville, Kentucky. And there's plenty of it, and a giant task to be done before Louisville can erase the scars of the record inundation.
As the floodwaters recede, WPA's greatest work really begins, the work of cleaning up. Water must be pumped from basements, in some cases with the help of fire trucks. Condemned structures must be demolished. Sanitation measures applied. Debris-clogged streets and roads must be opened and repaired, and this disease-bearing debris carted away. Although relief workers cannot repair private property unless public health is endangered, they can and do aid the property owner by removing heavy obstacles such as these. Fire and police alarm systems are put back in commission. Flooded underground wires being replaced with temporary overhead ones. In rural areas, thousands of dead cattle are a menace to health. These must be collected by relief workers and buried or otherwise disposed of. Tremendous work to be done, a tremendous need. The WPA does the work, meets the need with 150,000 people engaged in all phases of the cleanup job.
But sooner than many would have imagined, the Ohio Valley returns to normal. By early spring, most of the damage has been cleaned up.
A beautiful day in Louisville for the 63rd running of the Kentucky Derby in 1937. 103 colts nominated for this one, 20 go postward, headed by #1 War Admiral, a good one with Charlie Kurtzinger. He's the 8-5 favorite. He'll fly breaks.
When people came to the Derby, which was a few weeks later, first part of May, they wanted to see all this destruction that they'd been hearing about and reading about in Louisville, Kentucky. And they wanted to drive through the flooded areas. Well, they were very much taken aback when they drove through the flooded areas. They couldn't see much damage. People had gotten busy and cleaned up and painted their houses, and the things that were destroyed they'd thrown away and so on. And there was very little evidence of the flood for people to see.
And into the winner's circle now comes War Admiral. He's trained by George Conway. He's owned by the Glen Riddle Farm. He gets the traditional roses in the 63rd running of the Kentucky Derby.
Time moves on, and other events capture the nation's attention. The Great Flood of 1937 becomes history. More than half a century later, the statistics of the Great Flood remain staggering. 22 states were affected. Over 12,000 square miles were flooded. Nearly 800,000 people were at least temporarily homeless. Over 200 died as a direct result of the flood, and several hundred more died from flood-related causes. Over 3,000 homes, 1,100 barns, and 8,500 other buildings were totally destroyed. Losses of livestock and other farm animals totaled nearly 37,000, plus 250,000 poultry. Losses of family pets and other domestic animals exceeded 11,000. Several cities and towns were permanently altered by the flood. In Cincinnati, the fire left over 3 square miles of rubble. In Louisville, an entire residential area called The Point was abandoned and demolished. Only one building was left standing, and today the area is a city park. Almost the entire town of Leavenworth, Indiana, was relocated to higher ground. The total financial cost of the flood has never been accurately assessed, but in today's measurements, the cost would easily run into the tens of billions. Today, little remains as a direct reminder of the flood, but its story has become part of the folklore of the Ohio Valley. Here and there in towns along the river, small plaques point out the levels the water reached, and those who stop to notice them are often astounded at what they see. Visitors to Cincinnati's Coney Island Park can see a marker near the river comparing the many floods. To this day, people pause and point in wonder at the 37 flood level. A less noticeable legacy can be seen in many an old building along the river. Weakened by repeated floods, many buildings have been reinforced with iron rods held in place by ornate metal plates, usually in the shape of a star. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the flood is the system of vast walls and earthen mounds that today protect most of the cities along the river. As nothing before it had, the 1937 flood finally convinced everyone of the need for effective flood control in the Ohio Valley. In the years following the flood, an extensive system of levees, dams, and flood walls were constructed along the length of the river, and the work goes on to this day. Most of the levees are built to withstand flood levels several feet above that of 1937. Since that long ago January, the river has flooded again many times, but it has never come close to the 37 levels. The last major flood was in 1964, and if history holds true, then the river is overdue for another major flood. Officials of most cities along the river are confident that the modern flood control system will hold against any flood. Perhaps. But it may be valuable to remember that the record of the flood of 1884 stood unbroken for over 50 years, and few believed that the river could go any higher than that, until 1937. In the summer of 1993, the Mississippi River left its banks in the worst flood to strike the Mississippi Valley in this century. For hundreds of miles, levees failed and city after city was flooded. The most important lesson from this may very well be simply that in the end, the river will do what it chooses to do. Will the Ohio River rise again? Most certainly. A better question perhaps might be this: did the worst flood of the 20th century in the Ohio Valley happen over 50 years ago? Or is it yet to come? Only time will tell.